Hi there. Welcome to Fundraising from the Ground Up. And today we're talking about stewardship, specifically stewardship for small shop nonprofits. Now, before we dive in, I do want to talk about two things before my three things. First, I want to define stewardship. And this is kind of a stuffy term, and it might be, maybe it's wise. There are some teams and organizations that kind of shy away from it because it does sound very formal and something like you would have at a really gigantic organization with lots of people. But really, what stewardship is how you connect with and build relationships with your supporters after they have made a contribution to your nonprofit. And all that is about is communicating, learning more about them, building that relationship, bringing them closer to your organization, all of those activities involved in those things. So you can see how it's not necessarily just for larger organizations with thousands and thousands of supporters, but for every organization who has supporters of any kind, how important it is to nourish that relationship and keep them close to the organization so that they bring ongoing support to your organization for years to come. And then the second thing I do want to go over too is talking about supporters versus donors. Now, when I talk about fundraising tactics and strategies, I'm trying really hard to use the word supporter over donor because I do think that as a fundraising professional or somebody working in development, it's not only important for us to be focusing on the people who are contributing financially to our organization, our donors, but also people who are contributing in other ways. So I like to use the term supporters because I hope that it does encompass all kinds of contributions and support for an organization. And that could mean people who are giving financially, people who are donating their time, our volunteers, people who are lending life experience and knowledge to your organization, and also people who are advocating for your cause and your organization. I do think all of those kinds of support are important, and that stewardship should be a part of all of those relationships that you have. Okay, so I do sometimes catch myself because I've been working in this sector for a long time, and for a really long time, all we do talk about or have talked about is donors. And so sometimes I'll still say donors, but I will try and catch myself and use the term supporters as well, because I think that is a little bit more inclusive. And it also makes the work that we do as fundraisers, as leaders in nonprofit organizations, more meaningful and joyful to be inclusive, all kinds of support that lifts up an organization. So with those two things out of the way, we'll go into the three things about stewardship for small shops. And I don't want to intimidate anybody here, but I do have some professionally designed cards to introduce all these sections. So here we go. The first section is, why should I care? I mean, otherwise known as why. Why is it important to work stewardship into your plan for your nonprofit? I mean, it's important because when somebody makes a contribution, time, money, knowledge, whatever it is really important to make that contribution, or to show that that contribution is appreciated, that it is valued. Because think of a time maybe when you made a contribution to an organization and there was nothing happened after that contribution. There was maybe like a thank you email or something like that, but after that communication stopped. And how does that make you feel? Like, it makes you feel like you're disconnected, like maybe the contribution didn't actually matter that much. And then when the time comes around again to make another contribution to help that organization again, you perhaps think twice about it because deep down you did not feel appreciated. So stewardship is really formalizing and organizing those acts of appreciation, of gratitude, to make sure that they happen for every supporter that you have. And that scenario that I just played out there kind of lends itself into this crisis, I think, that is really happening across the sector. Maybe crisis, I don't know if that's a term that we should use, but a trend perhaps of donor retention rates or supporter retention rates. I mean, we do talk about donor retention because that's where all the data is, but those retention rates are quite low. And most statistics that you'll see, most reports that are commissioned will show retention rates of around 40 to 45%, which means that of all of the donors that you can come on your in 1 year, only 40% were going to make another contribution the next year. So there's a lot of investment and energy and time and strategy that goes into acquiring and bringing on new supporters. And after all that work, 60% aren't going to support again. We see this as well with volunteers. I think there is a real sort of lack of volunteers right now, especially coming out of the pandemic. There probably are a lot of factors just involved with that. But with volunteers as well, there's a real struggle to find and keep volunteers. So stewardship is important to have a plan to engage with and build relationships with these people who are going to help you grow and really support you for years to come. The next section here, again, amazing graphic ahead. Why stewardship is actually a superpower for small nonprofits. And I like this because, like I said, when often you have an idea that something like this is really for complex, vast organizations, and perhaps as a smaller shop with a lean team, you might not be able to pull off the same thing. But my argument is that is not true. And actually, as opposed to being at a disadvantage, I do think smaller shops are at an advantage when it comes to stewardship. You definitely have the opportunity to build longer term, more personal one-to-one connections with your donors based on just the fact that you have a smaller, more tight-knit team. With stewardship, the big thing is building that relationship and bringing people close and making them feel like we're making them understand that their contribution is incredibly important and that without it, we can't do the work that we do. And the best way to do that is to give them access to some of that critical work that is happening through speaking with leaders, your executive director, your senior staff members. And as a small team, those executive directors, senior staff members are often hands-on the ground, working in programs or building those partnerships. So they have access to all this information, and through their conversations with supporters can really build that relationship so that it is clear that community support in any form can be beneficial and is pretty vital to the work that they do. Also, with smaller shops, you have less bureaucracy, more flexibility. You have opportunities to be really creative and stand out with your relationships that you're building. Larger organizations have to do this work on a large, huge scale. And the larger the scale, the harder it is to build up those personal one-to-one connections with your supporters. So smaller organizations have that opportunity to be unique and stand out. And especially when you're building relationships with supporters who have the capacity and inclination to provide sustaining support, so larger financial gifts, that's a big positive for small organizations, is that opportunity to really get them involved and to have them see close up how things are working and how their support could potentially really make an impact in the community. So I would say that is a superpower that you have as a small organization. So why not do that? Because it is an incredibly important part of the development, fundraising, community building process that every nonprofit organization has to implement at some point. All right. And so then the last section, then, our third thing is fitting it in. How are we fitting stewardship into the day? And with small shops, of course, you have a leaner team. Your staff are wearing multiple hats, and often stewardship is one of those things that is put on the back burner indefinitely because you just don't have time, or it doesn't feel like you have time to do it. I would argue that if there's a plan in place and you intentionally plug it into your day, you have time to do it, because stewardship, for the most part, is stuff that is not going to take up massive chunks of your time. I mean, there are things like events that happen from time to time where you're meeting with people or doing tours or what have you, that is going to take up more time. But honestly, the largest amount of time that's going to need to be invested in a stewardship program, a stewardship plan, is upfront. So I have three tips for my third thing. And that's my first one, is that it really has to be an intentional thing. It has to be a priority set for the organization as a whole, to say, this is something we are working on, all of us together, is we are making stewardship, building relationships with our current supporters, a priority. And these are the reasons. And we can talk about retention and community building and how it just makes the organization stronger overall in the long run. And by everybody in the organization, I do mean leadership, I do mean board members and staff, volunteers. Everybody has to be on board with this idea that showing authentic gratitude, that bringing people closer in an organized way, in an intentional way, is a really important thing to do. And then as a result of that, having that intention, that priority, building it into strategic documents or to work plans, you are better able to delegate to strengths across your team. So if you decide that an important part of the stewardship plan is to communicate regularly with your supporters over email, you're able to work that into the plan, delegate it to the person who is, their role is to write up that newsletter. Their strength is good communication over email. That's their job. That's just an example. So my second tip for that, for how to fit stewardship into your day, would be to build in automations whenever possible. And I know this is a little bit scary, and it's another thing that is a little bit more front loaded in terms of time investment. But I will tell you, it is possible, and it will really revolutionize the way you work and the way you communicate by building in those automations. And what I mean by an automation, that there's a process, a workflow that's happening. So for example, if you've got a person who's made a donation through your online donor form, there are some steps that will happen after that donation is made that are automatic, that once they're set up, you don't have to actually press anything or do anything. That will just happen automatically. And this you can do through software like your email service provider, like for example, MailChimp. They have plugins that you can create those automations. There are lots of CRMs out there that can do it as well. You just have to do a little bit of research and exploration about it. But like I said, it is a game changer. It's a way to really build that relationship without having to do a lot other than that initial setup. And an example of that, like I said, would be that welcome package that somebody's getting. And they'll be getting, once they make that donation, they're getting 3 or 4 emails after, so that by the end of that automation sequence, they know a lot about the organization, about what you're doing, about how donations are helping your organization, and then perhaps even ways to support the organization even further. So that is a much stronger relationship than if you had just sent off the tax receipt and called it a day, and then it maybe landed on somebody's desk to follow up with them a couple months later. Okay, and then the third thing is setting up tasks through your gift processing workflow for some of the more, especially those more one-to-one contacts that need to happen. So if, for example, you've got a corporate donor or somebody who is making a more sustaining donation to the organization, a larger donation, in your gift processing workflow, which is a set of steps detailing what happens and who's responsible for each task from when the donation is made all the way up to the follow-up. Make sure that there's a stewardship piece in that workflow. And if it's something that needs to happen months down the line, then that step will be adding a to-do into your project management system, whatever that is, tagging the person responsible and adding a reminder so that they can do it. And depending on your setup, that could go directly onto their calendar. They could get a nudge. It's a really important thing, especially with those relationships that are going to be longer, over a longer period of years, that could have the potential to grow into something really transformative for your organization. It's pretty critical to plug those in right away so that you're not having to rely on your memory to follow up. And so that can happen through a project management tool like Asana or Trello or a spreadsheet or whatever it is that you're doing that's working for your team. Put those in your procedure step, in your workflow, and those stewardship steps will happen. They'll just be entered, they'll just go into your regular routine. Okay, so I will summarize and put those 3 tips for the time management piece in the comments of this stream, but that's it for today. I really appreciate you joining and watching the video. And if you haven't already connected with me, you can do so on LinkedIn. I'm also definitely interested in chatting with anyone who wants to network or who's interested in working on those fundraising strategies for their small nonprofit. You can check out my website, cedarfundraising.ca, for more information on the services I provide, and a booking link as well if you want to connect. But we'll see you next week.